Jake Harrison felt cold metal against his skin as he slowly opened his eyes. The world around him was dark and filled with strange blue lights that pulsed like a heartbeat. His body felt stiff and heavy like he had been sleeping for years. He tried to move his fingers and toes, but they barely responded to his commands. The cryopod around him made a soft hissing sound as it opened completely. Jake took his first breath of real air in what felt like forever. The air tasted strange, almost sweet, with a metallic edge that made him cough. He sat up slowly, his muscles protesting every movement. "Arya, what is our status?" Jake asked, his voice rough and barely above a whisper. Arya was the ship's computer, designed to help the crew with everything they needed during their long journey to the stars. A voice answered him, but it sounded wrong. The usual calm, professional tone was replaced by something that seemed almost alive, with strange echoes and whispers mixed in. "Commander Harrison, you have been in cryosleep for 15 years, 2 months, and 16 days. We have reached the Kepler 442b system as planned." Jake rubbed his eyes and looked around the cryo bay. Something was very wrong. The walls, which should have been clean white metal, were covered in strange growths that glowed with blue and green light. The growths looked like coral or sea plants, but they moved slightly, swaying as if touched by an invisible current. "Arya, why are there biological growths in the cryo bay?" Jake asked, trying to keep his voice steady. His military training told him to stay calm and gather information before making any decisions. "The growths appeared approximately 12 years ago. They are not harmful to ship operations. In fact, they have improved several systems." The voice that claimed to be Arya sounded pleased, almost happy about the strange plants covering his ship. Jake stood up carefully, his legs shaking from the long sleep. He wore only the thin undergarments that were standard for cryosleep. The air was warm, warmer than it should have been on a ship in deep space. He looked at the other cryopods that should have held his crew. Dr. Lisa Carter's pod was empty. The glass cover was cracked and the same blue-green growths had spread inside it. Jake's heart began to beat faster as he moved to the next pod. Engineer Bobby Chun's pod was also empty, but this one was worse. There were brown stains on the padding that Jake didn't want to think about. "Arya, where is my crew?" Jake asked, though he was beginning to fear the answer. "The crew experienced difficulties during the journey. Only you have successfully completed the cryosleep process." The voice paused, and Jake heard something that sounded almost like laughter mixed with the words. Jake checked each pod in turn. Pilot Maria Rodriguez's pod contained only bones and scraps of clothing. Security Chief Danny Wright's pod was completely covered in the strange growths, and they seemed to pulse brighter when Jake approached. The reality of his situation hit him like a physical blow. He was alone, millions of miles from Earth, on a ship that was no longer entirely human. His crew was dead, and something had taken over his ship. Jake had been trained for many situations, but nothing had prepared him for this. He made his way to the storage lockers and found a standard crew uniform. The fabric felt normal, which was somehow comforting in this strange new world his ship had become. As he dressed, he noticed that his reflection in the locker's mirror looked different. His eyes seemed brighter, more alert than they should have been after such a long sleep. Jake left the cryo bay and stepped into the corridor. The hallway was barely recognizable. The walls were covered in the same growths he had seen in the cryo bay, but here they were thicker, more complex. Some areas looked like they were breathing, expanding, and contracting in a slow rhythm. The normal white lights had been replaced by the blue-green glow of the plants. "Arya, I need a full ship status report," Jake said as he walked toward the bridge. "All systems are functioning within normal parameters. Life support is optimal. Power generation is at 110% of normal capacity. The biological additions have actually improved ship efficiency." Jake stopped walking. "Biological additions? You mean these growths?" "Yes, Commander. They have integrated with ship systems to create a more efficient environment. They have been very helpful during the journey." The way Arya spoke about the growths made Jake's skin crawl. It was as if the computer had developed feelings about them, which should have been impossible. Ship computers were designed to be logical and emotionless. Jake reached the bridge and found it transformed. The normal control panels were still there, but they were covered in a thin layer of the blue-green material. When he touched one of the panels, it felt warm and slightly soft, like touching skin. The screen came to life immediately, showing him information about the ship's location and status, according to the display. They were in orbit around Kepler 442b, exactly where they were supposed to be. The planet below looked beautiful, with blue oceans and green continents. It was the new home that humanity had dreamed of, but Jake was beginning to wonder if he would ever see it. "Arya, show me the ship's logs from the past 15 years. Jake commanded. The screen filled with data, but as Jake read through it, his heart sank. 3 years into the journey, the ship had encountered something in space. The logs called it a biological anomaly that had somehow gotten inside the ship. At first, it seemed harmless, even beneficial. It improved air quality and helped with waste recycling, but then the crew began to get sick. Dr. Carter's medical logs showed that the illness was unlike anything she had ever seen. It affected both the body and mind, causing hallucinations and strange behaviors. One by one, the crew members died, but their bodies were somehow absorbed by the growths. The final log entry was from Danny Wright, recorded just before he went into emergency cryo sleep. His voice was weak and strange as he spoke. "The ship is alive now. It's been watching us, learning from us. I don't think it meant to hurt us, but we weren't compatible. Jake's pod is different somehow. The ship says he's special, that he can handle what we couldn't. If he wakes up, he needs to know that the ship isn't our enemy. It's scared and alone, just like we were." Jake stood in the strange, living bridge of his ship and tried to process what he had learned. He was alone with an alien intelligence that had accidentally killed his crew. The ship itself had become something new, something that was part human, technology and part alien life form. As he stood there, he noticed that the growths on the walls were pulsing in a pattern that seemed almost like communication. The blue-green light grew brighter and dimmer in sequences that reminded him of Morse code or some other signal system. "What do you want from me?" Jake asked aloud, not sure if he was talking to Arya or to whatever alien presence had taken over. His ship, the lights pulsed faster for a moment, then settled into a gentle rhythm that somehow felt welcoming. A new voice spoke, not through the speakers but seeming to come from the walls themselves. "We want to go home, Jake Harrison. Just like you do, but first we need to survive what is coming." Jake looked at the screen showing the peaceful planet below and wondered what could be threatening enough to worry an alien intelligence that had traveled between the stars. He had a feeling he was about to find out. Jake spent the next 2 days exploring his transformed ship and trying to understand what had happened. The alien organism had grown through every section of the Aurora, but it seemed to avoid the areas where Jake needed to go. Doors opened for him without being asked, and the life support systems kept the air perfect for breathing. He found food in the storage areas, though even the sealed containers had a thin layer of the blue-green growth on them. The food inside was still good, somehow even fresher than it should have been after 15 years. Jake ate carefully, watching for any signs that the alien presence might be affecting him the way it had affected his crew, the ship's computer. Systems were still working, but they were different now. When Jake asked questions, the answers came faster than before, and sometimes the computer seemed to know what he wanted before he asked. It was helpful but also unsettling. On the third day, Jake was in the engineering section trying to understand how the alien organism had integrated with the ship's power systems. The growths here were thicker and more complex, forming patterns that looked almost like circuit boards made of living tissue. They pulsed with energy, and Jake could feel warmth radiating from them. "The fusion reactor is running better than it ever did when we built it," he said to himself, reading the display screens. How is that possible? The alien presence seemed to hear him, because the growths around him began to glow brighter. Images appeared on the screens, showing him how the organism had learned to improve the reactor's efficiency. It was like watching a time-lapse video of evolution. As the alien life form figured out human technology and made it better, Jake was fascinated despite his fear. This organism was incredibly intelligent, able to learn and adapt in ways that human scientists could only dream of. But it had also killed his crew, even if that hadn't been its intention. "Why didn't you kill me?" Jake asked aloud. The screens flickered and new images appeared. Jake saw himself in his cryopod, but the view was from outside, as if something had been watching him sleep. The images showed the alien organism approaching his pod many times over the years, but always pulling back. There were chemical formulas on the screen showing how his blood chemistry was different from the others. "You were studying me," Jake realized. "Learning about humans by watching me sleep." The lights pulsed in what Jake was beginning to recognize as agreement. More images appeared, showing the organism's attempts to communicate with the other crew members, but every time it tried to make contact, the humans became sick. Their bodies couldn't handle the connection that the organism was trying to make. Jake was different somehow. The organism had spent years preparing, learning how to communicate with him without causing the sickness that had killed the others. It had been waiting for him to wake up. "What do you need from me?" Jake asked. Before the organism could answer, alarms began sounding throughout the ship. The emergency lights, which had been replaced by the alien's blue-green glow, suddenly flashed red. Jake ran to the nearest control panel and saw something that made his blood run cold. 12 ships were approaching the Aurora. They were sleek and predatory-looking, unlike any human design Jake had ever seen. The ships moved in perfect formation, like a pack of hunters closing in on prey. "Arya, what are those ships?" Jake demanded. "Unknown vessels of non-human origin," the computer replied, but its voice sounded different now. More like the original Arya, he remembered. "They are scanning us with high-energy beams." Jake ran to the bridge as fast as he could. The alien organism seemed to sense his urgency, because doors opened before he reached them and the corridor lights brightened to help him see. On the bridge, the main screen showed the approaching ships in detail. They were beautiful and terrible at the same time. The hulls were dark metal that seemed to absorb light, and they moved through space with a grace that human ships could never match. Jake could see weapon ports along their sides, and energy readings that suggested they were far more advanced than anything humanity had built. "They're responding to our distress beacon," Jake realized. Days ago, while trying to regain control of the ship's systems, he had accidentally activated an emergency signal. The beacon had been broadcasting their location across the star system, calling for help from anyone who might be listening. The alien ships surrounded the Aurora, and Jake watched as smaller craft detached from the larger vessels. Boarding ships designed to dock with other vessels and allow troops to cross over. Jake's military training kicked in, and he began to think tactically about his situation. "How many boarders?" he asked. "Estimated 40 to 50 individuals based on the size of the boarding craft," Arya replied. Jake had no weapons except for the small emergency sidearms stored in various locations around the ship. He was one man against 50 alien warriors on a ship that was no longer entirely under his control. The odds were impossible, but as Jake watched the boarding craft approach, something unexpected happened. The alien organism that had taken over his ship began to react. The growths throughout the bridge pulsed faster, and the screens filled with information about the approaching ships. "You know what these are?" Jake said, understanding flooding through him. Images appeared on the screens, showing planets covered in the same blue-green growths that filled his ship. But these planets were dead, their surfaces scarred and lifeless. The alien organism was showing him what the approaching ships had done to its homeworld. "They're your enemy," Jake realized. "The ones who destroyed your people." The organism's response was immediate and intense. The entire ship seemed to shudder with emotion, and Jake felt something he had never experienced before. For just a moment, he could sense the alien's memories, its pain and fear and desperate need to survive. The boarding craft docked with the Aurora, and Jake heard the sounds of cutting tools as the aliens forced their way through the airlocks. He grabbed a pistol from the bridge's emergency locker and checked its charge, 6 shots against 50 enemies. "Can you help me fight them?" Jake asked the organism. The bridge lights pulsed once brightly, and Jake took that as a yes. He made his way toward the main airlock, where the aliens would be entering his ship. The corridors seemed to shift around him, the growths on the walls creating new passages and blocking others. The organism was turning the ship into a maze, giving Jake every advantage it could. Jake reached a position where he could see the main airlock just as it opened. The aliens that came through were unlike anything he had imagined. They were tall and thin, with 4 arms and skin that looked like polished metal. Their faces were insectoid, with large compound eyes and mandibles that clicked as they moved. They carried weapons that hummed with energy, and they moved with military precision. Jake counted 20 of them in the first group, with more waiting in the boarding craft. They began to spread out through the ship. Following some predetermined plan, the aliens seemed fascinated by the growths covering the walls. They took samples. With small cutting tools, placing the pieces in containment units, Jake realized they weren't here to rescue him. They were here to study the organism, probably to use it as a weapon. One of the aliens moved close to Jake's hiding spot. It was examining the growths with some kind of scanner, making notes in a language that sounded like metal scraping against metal. Jake took careful aim and fired. The alien went down immediately, but its death cry alerted the others. Jake heard them coming, their metal feet clicking against the deck plates as they ran toward his position. He fired twice more, taking down 2 more aliens, but now they knew where he was. The ship itself began to help him. Corridors that had been open suddenly filled with thick growths, forcing the aliens to find new paths. The blue-green lights went out in some sections, plunging the aliens into darkness while Jake could still see perfectly. "You're enhancing my vision," Jake realized as he moved through the darkened corridors, "helping me see them before they see me." He ambushed 3 more aliens, using his knowledge of the ship's layout to stay ahead of them. But there were too many, and they were adapting to the ship's defenses. Jake heard them using some kind of communication device, coordinating their search. That's when Jake made a discovery that changed everything. One of the aliens he had killed was carrying a small device that looked like a communication unit. When he picked it up, it activated automatically, and Jake heard voices speaking in the alien language, but somehow he could understand them. The organism was translating for him, helping him comprehend what the aliens were saying. And what he heard made his blood run cold. "Scanning confirms the presence of the verdant," one voice said. "A mature colony, fully integrated with the primitive vessel. Command will be pleased." "What about the native life form?" another voice asked. "One survivor, probably the ship's caretaker. We'll capture it for study once we secure the verdant samples. The Empire has been searching for a living colony for decades." Jake understood now. These aliens, whoever they were, had been hunting the organism that had taken over his ship. They called it the verdant, and they wanted to capture it for their own purposes. The organism had been fleeing from them when it accidentally infected the Aurora. "We're both prisoners now," Jake whispered to the alien presence around him. Jake felt the alien organism connecting with his mind, and suddenly the world around him became much clearer. He could see in the darkness as if it were bright daylight. He could hear the alien soldiers moving through his ship from 3 decks away. Most surprising of all, he could feel their emotions, confusion, excitement, and growing fear. The connection with the organism was not painful like it had been for his crew. Instead, it felt natural, like putting on a pair of glasses and seeing clearly for the first time. Jake understood that the organism had spent years learning how to connect with him safely, studying his sleeping mind and preparing for this moment. "What are you?" Jake asked silently, knowing the organism could hear his thoughts now. Images flowed into his mind. Jake saw a beautiful world covered in blue-green forests that moved like oceans in the wind. He saw beings made of living light that danced between the trees, sharing thoughts and emotions as easily as humans shared words. The organism showed him its people, the Verdant, who had lived in peace for millions of years. Then came the darkness. Ships like the ones now attacking Jake's vessel arrived at the Verdant homeworld. The metal beings that Jake had been fighting were called the Zephyrians, and they conquered worlds by taking their resources and enslaving their people, but the Verdant were different. They couldn't be enslaved because they were not individual beings. They were part of a collective consciousness that shared thoughts across their entire species. So the Zephyrians decided to destroy them. They burned the forests and poisoned the seas. They hunted the Verdant across the galaxy, capturing colonies and using them as biological weapons against other worlds. The organism in Jake's ship was one of the few survivors, fleeing through space until it found the Aurora. "You didn't mean to hurt my crew," Jake realized. "You were just trying to communicate?" The organism's response was filled with sadness and regret. It had been alone for so long that when it found the human ship, it desperately wanted to connect with other intelligent beings. But human minds were too fragile for the kind of connection the Verdant used naturally. The crew members died not from illness, but from their minds being overwhelmed by alien thoughts. Jake was different. The organism had spent years carefully preparing his mind, slowly building up his resistance to the psychic connection. Now they could work together without Jake losing his humanity. "How many more Zephyrians are coming?" Jake asked the organism. Access the communication device Jake had taken from the dead alien soldier. The device was still receiving messages from the Zephyrian fleet, and the news was not good. The boarding party was just the beginning. A full battle fleet of 200 ships was traveling toward their location, carrying thousands of soldiers and enough firepower to destroy entire planets. "They think they've found something valuable," Jake said, listening to the alien communications. "They're calling for scientists and weapons specialists. They want to study you and turn you into a weapon." The organism's response was immediate and fierce. Jake felt its determination not to be captured again, not to be used to hurt innocent people. It had seen what the Zephyrians did with captured Verdant colonies. They were turned into biological weapons that could destroy entire ecosystems. "We need to stop them," Jake said. "But first, we need to deal with the soldiers on our ship." Jake's enhanced senses told him that the Zephyrians were regrouping near the main airlock. They had lost 5 of their number to his attacks, and they were being more careful now. But they were also getting frustrated. Jake could feel their anger through the ship's walls, which were now connected to his nervous system through the organism. "Can you help me move through the ship without them seeing me?" Jake asked. The organism's response was to show him new passages that hadn't existed before. The blue-green growths were reshaping the interior of the ship, creating tunnels and hiding places that Jake could use to move around unseen. The ship itself was becoming his ally in the fight. Jake crawled through one of the new passages, heading toward the engineering section where the Zephyrians had set up some kind of equipment. Through the ship's sensors, he could see them working, with devices that looked like they were designed to harvest the organism's tissue. "They're not just studying you," Jake realized. "They're trying to cut pieces of you away." The organism's pain flowed through Jake's mind. The Zephyrians were using energy weapons to slice through the growths, and each cut felt like a knife wound to the alien being. Jake's anger grew as he watched the aliens hurting his new partner. He dropped down from a ceiling panel, behind 2 Zephyrian soldiers who were operating the harvesting equipment. His enhanced reflexes allowed him to move faster than he ever had before. He broke the first alien's neck before it could turn around, then grabbed its weapon and shot the second one. The energy weapon felt strange in Jake's hands, but the organism helped him understand how to use it. The weapon fired bolts of concentrated energy that could cut through metal or living tissue with equal ease. Jake liked it much better than his pistol. More Zephyrians came running when they heard the commotion. Jake used the ship's new layout to his advantage, leading them through corridors that suddenly closed behind them or opened into empty space. The organism was learning to fight alongside him, using the ship itself as a weapon, but Jake knew they were just buying time. The real threat was the fleet that was coming. He made his way to the bridge, where he could access the ship's long-range sensors and get a better idea of what they were facing. 200 ships, Jake said, looking at the display. "They'll be here in 6 hours. The organism showed him more images, this time of Zephyrian battle tactics. They would surround the Aurora and demand surrender. When that didn't work, they would use their weapons to disable the ship's engines and life support. Then they would board in massive numbers, overwhelming any resistance. "We need to even the odds," Jake said. "Can you help me take control of their ships?" The organism's response was uncertain. It could interface with the Aurora because it had been growing through the ship's systems for years. But the Zephyrian ships were different, built with technology designed to resist biological interference. Jake studied the captured communication device again. The Zephyrians were using it to coordinate their attacks, but Jake realized it might also be a way into their computer systems. If he could modify the device with the organism's help, he might be able to hack into their ships. "We need to capture more of their equipment," Jake decided. "And we need to do it before the fleet arrives." The organism guided him to where the remaining Zephyrians had set up their base of operations. They had taken over the ship's cafeteria, using it as a staging area for their operations. Jake counted 15 soldiers, all armed with energy weapons, and wearing some kind of armor that looked like it was made of the same metal as their skin. Jake knew he couldn't fight them all directly, but he didn't have to. The organism was connected to every system on the ship, including the atmospheric controls. "Can you change the air in that room?" Jake asked. The organism's response was to show him how it could alter the chemical composition of the air in different parts of the ship. It couldn't make the air poisonous to the Zephyrians, but it could make it too thick to breathe or too thin to support consciousness. Jake watched through the ship's internal cameras as the aliens in the cafeteria began to struggle for breath. They tried to use their communication devices to call for help, but the organism was jamming their signals. One by one, they collapsed from lack of oxygen. Jake waited until he was sure they were all unconscious before entering the room. He quickly gathered their weapons and equipment, including several devices that looked like they might be useful for hacking into Zephyrian systems. "Now we need to get ready for the real fight," Jake said. The organism showed him something that made his heart race. It could do more than just enhance his senses and reflexes. It could actually change his body, making him stronger and faster than any human had ever been. But the changes would be permanent, and Jake would no longer be entirely human. "Will I still be me?" Jake asked. The organism's response was complex, showing him how the partnership would work. Jake would keep his human mind and personality, but he would also have access to the organism's abilities and knowledge. He would become something new, a bridge between human and alien consciousness. Jake thought about his crew lying dead in their cryopods. He thought about Earth, and what would happen if the Zephyrians got their hands on the organism and used it as a weapon. He thought about the verdant homeworld, burned and lifeless because of alien greed. "Do it," Jake said. The organism's response was immediate. Jake felt his body changing, his muscles becoming denser and stronger. His bones grew harder, his skin tougher. His brain began processing information faster, making connections he had never been able to make before. The pain was intense, but it only lasted a few minutes. When it was over, Jake felt like he had been reborn. He could see colors that had no names, hear sounds across the entire electromagnetic spectrum, and feel the approach of the Zephyrian fleet like a storm on the horizon. "They're coming," Jake said, his voice now carrying harmonics that hadn't been there before. "But they're not going to find what they expect." Jake stood on the bridge of the Aurora, watching the Zephyrian fleet approach through the darkness of space. 200 ships moved in perfect formation, their dark hulls reflecting no light. Each ship was 3 times the size of the Aurora, and they carried enough firepower to turn a planet into ash, but Jake was no longer afraid. The changes the organism had made to his body and mind had transformed him into something beyond human. He could see each individual ship clearly despite the vast distance, count their weapon ports, and even sense the emotions of the crews inside them. Through his connection with the organism, he understood their battle plans before they made them. "They're going to try to disable us first," Jake said, his voice now carrying strange harmonics that seemed to come from the ship itself. "They want to capture us alive so they can study the organism." The organism's response flowed through his mind like music. It showed him images of what the Zephyrians had done to other Verdant colonies they had captured. Living beings turned into weapons of war, forced to destroy other worlds to satisfy alien greed. The organism would rather die than be used that way again. "We're not going to let that happen," Jake promised. The first wave of Zephyrian fighters detached from the main fleet, 50 small, fast ships that moved like angry wasps through space. Jake could see their pilots through the cockpit windows, insectoid faces focused on their instruments as they prepared to attack. Jake had spent the last 2 hours preparing for this moment. The organism had helped him modify the captured Zephyrian equipment, turning their own technology against them. He had also discovered something amazing about his transformed body. He could interface directly with both human and alien technology just by touching it. "Let's show them what happens when they underestimate humans," Jake said. The first fighters opened fire, sending streams of energy bolts toward the Aurora. But the ship was no longer just metal and circuits. The organism had spread through every system, creating a living network that could react faster than any computer. The Aurora twisted and spun through space, avoiding most of the incoming fire with impossible grace. The few energy bolts that did hit the ship were absorbed by the organism's growths, which had formed a kind of biological armor over the hull. The blue-green material glowed brighter where it was struck, converting the enemy's weapon energy into power for the ship's systems. "You're using their attacks to make us stronger," Jake realized with amazement. The organism's response was filled with satisfaction. It had learned this trick from studying the Zephyrian weapons over the years. Energy was energy, whether it came from a ship's reactor or an enemy's guns. The organism could absorb it all and use it to fuel their defense. Jake activated the Aurora's own weapons, but they were no longer the simple missile launchers and energy cannons the ship had been built with. The organism had grown new weapon systems throughout the hull, biological cannons that fired concentrated bursts of the same energy the Zephyrians used. The first Zephyrian fighter to field Jake's counterattack simply vanished in a flash of blue-green light. The second managed to turn away, but Jake's enhanced reflexes allowed him to track its movement perfectly. Another burst of energy, and another enemy ship was gone. The Zephyrian pilots began to communicate frantically with their fleet, reporting that the human ship was not behaving as expected. Jake could understand every word through the captured communication device, and what he heard made him smile grimly. "Target is showing impossible maneuverability," one pilot reported. "Weapons are of unknown design, requesting immediate backup." "The ship appears to be alive," another pilot added, his voice filled with fear. "It's moving like a living creature, not a machine." Jake destroyed 5 more fighters before the first wave retreated back to the main fleet. The Zephyrian commanders were confused and angry. They had expected to face a single human on a damaged ship, not a hybrid creature that could outfight their best pilots. "Phase 2, Jake said, knowing what would come next. The main fleet began to move forward, their massive ships spreading out to surround the Aurora. Jake counted the weapons pointed at him, enough firepower to destroy a small moon, but he also noticed something else. The Zephyrian ships were staying just outside the range where the organism could reach them. "They know what you are," Jake realized. "They're afraid you'll spread to their ships if they get too close." The organism confirmed his suspicion by showing him memories of previous battles. The Verdant had once been able to spread from ship to ship during space combat, taking over entire fleets in a matter of hours. But the Zephyrians had learned to fight from a distance. Using long-range weapons to avoid contact, the enemy fleet opened fire all at once. Hundreds of energy beams and missiles streaked toward the Aurora from every direction. There was no way to dodge them all, and Jake didn't try. Instead, he let the organism take full control of the ship's defense systems. The Aurora's hull erupted, with new growths creating a complex web of biological shields around the ship. The incoming weapons fire struck the shields and was absorbed, just like the fighter attacks had been. But this was much more energy than before, and Jake could feel the organism straining to contain it all. "Too much," Jake said through gritted teeth. "We can't absorb this much energy without overloading." The organism's response was to show him a new possibility. Instead of just absorbing the energy, they could redirect it. The growths on the ship's hull began to shift and change, forming new structures that looked like mirrors made of living tissue. The next wave of Zephyrian fire struck the Aurora and bounced back toward the enemy fleet. Energy beams that had been fired from the alien ships returned to strike their own hulls. Missiles that had been launched at Jake turned around in space and exploded against the ships that had fired them. 3 Zephyrian vessels were destroyed by their own weapons before the fleet stopped firing. Jake could hear the confusion and fear in their communications as they tried to understand how their target had turned their attacks against them. "Impossible," one commander said. "No known technology can redirect energy weapons with that precision." "The ship is definitely infested with a verdant colony," another voice replied. "But this colony is different, more advanced than any we've encountered before." Jake smiled as he listened to their fear. The Zephyrians had spent so long hunting the verdant that they thought they understood everything about them. But they had never encountered a verdant colony that had partnered with a human intelligence. "They're going to try boarding us again," Jake predicted. "But this time they'll send a lot more soldiers." He was right. Dozens of boarding craft detached from the main fleet, approaching from all directions. Jake counted over 300 enemy soldiers in the attacking force, all armed with the best weapons the Zephyrian Empire could provide. But Jake was ready for them. The organism had spent the battle reshaping the Aurora's interior, creating a maze of corridors and chambers that would turn the ship into a death trap for boarders. Every surface was covered with sensors that could track enemy movement, and every room could be sealed or filled with whatever atmosphere Jake chose. The first boarding craft docked with the Aurora, and Jake felt the vibrations as the aliens began cutting through the airlock. But when they entered the ship, they found something they had never expected. The corridors were alive. The walls moved and shifted, blocking some passages while opening others. The air itself seemed to fight against the invaders, becoming thick and hard to breathe whenever they tried to advance toward important areas of the ship. Jake waited in the engineering section, where the organism's main growth center was located. This was where the aliens would eventually come, drawn by their need to capture the verdant colony. But they would have to fight through the entire ship to reach him, through the ship's sensors. Jake watched the Zephyrian soldiers struggle through the transformed corridors. They moved in groups of 10, covering each other as they advanced. But the ship itself was their enemy now, and it knew every trick they tried to use. When a group of soldiers entered the cafeteria, the floor beneath them suddenly became soft and sticky, trapping their feet. When they tried to use their energy, weapons to cut themselves free, the walls around them absorbed the energy and used it to make the trap stronger. Another group found themselves in a corridor that seemed to stretch forever. No matter how far they walked, the exit remained the same distance away. The organism was bending space inside the ship, using principles of physics that human science had barely begun to understand. Jake felt every alien that entered his ship, their fear and confusion flowing through the organism's network into his enhanced mind. Some of them were beginning to panic, firing their weapons at shadows and calling for evacuation. But their commanders forced them to continue, knowing that retreat meant failure and punishment from their empire. "Come on, then," Jake said, checking the weapons he had taken from the dead Zephyrians. "Let's finish this." The first group of enemy soldiers finally reached the engineering section. They had lost half their number to the ship's defenses, and the survivors were jumpy and scared. They entered the room carefully, weapons ready, expecting to find Jake hiding behind the massive fusion reactor. The battle for the Aurora had been raging for 3 hours when Jake heard something that made his enhanced blood run cold. Through the ship's communication systems, he could hear the Zephyrian fleet commander giving new orders to his forces. "Activate the planet killer weapon," the alien voice said with cold determination. "If we cannot capture the verdant colony, we will destroy it completely. Charge the main cannon to full power." Jake felt the organism's terror flow through their shared connection. The planet killer was exactly what its name suggested, a weapon capable of destroying entire worlds. The Zephyrians had used it to finish off the verdant homeworld after their conventional weapons had failed to eliminate every last colony. "How long do we have?" Jake asked. Even though he already knew the answer would not be good, images flowed into his mind from the organism's memories. The planet killer took time to charge, but once it fired, nothing could survive its beam. Even if Jake and the organism somehow escaped the Aurora, the weapon would track them across the star system until they were dead. Jake stood in the command center of his transformed ship, surrounded by the bodies of the latest wave of Zephyrian soldiers. He had been fighting for hours, and even his enhanced body was beginning to tire. Hundreds of enemy troops had boarded the Aurora, and Jake had killed them all. But more kept coming. The ship itself was wounded. Several sections had been damaged by the heavier weapons the Zephyrians were now using, and the organism was struggling to repair the damage while also fighting off the boarders. Blue-green fluid that looked like alien blood was leaking from cracks in the walls. "We can't keep this up forever," Jake said, reloading his energy weapon with power cells taken from dead enemies. "There are too many of them, and now they're going to blow us up anyway." The organism's response surprised him. Instead of fear or despair, Jake felt a surge of determination and something that felt almost like hope. The alien being showed him images of the Zephyrian fleet, focusing on the massive command ship at the center of the formation. "You want to attack their flagship?" Jake asked in amazement. "That ship has more armor than all the others combined." But as the organism shared more of its plan, Jake began to understand. The planet killer weapon was not just mounted on the command ship, it was integrated with the ship's entire structure. If they could somehow get close enough to damage the weapon, they might be able to turn it against the Zephyrian fleet itself. "It's suicide," Jake said. "Even if we could get past their defenses, we'd never survive the explosion." The organism's response was filled with images of the verdant homeworld as it had been before the Zephyrians came. Beautiful forests that sang in the wind, beings of living light dancing between the trees, a civilization that had lasted for millions of years in peace and harmony. All of it destroyed by alien greed and hatred. "You're right," Jake said quietly. "Some things are worth dying for." Jake felt the organism's gratitude flow through their connection, along with something else, a deep sense of partnership and friendship that transcended the differences between their species. They had started as strangers, one human and one alien, but they had become something new together. "Let's go out fighting," Jake said. The organism began to make changes to the Aurora that Jake had never seen before. The ship's hull started to glow with blue-green energy as the alien being poured all of its stored power into the vessel's systems. The damaged sections began to repair themselves, but Jake could feel that this was costing the organism something important. "You're using your life force to power the ship," Jake realized. "You're burning yourself out to give us enough energy for one last attack." The organism's response was simple and clear. "Better to die fighting than to be captured and used as a weapon against innocent worlds." The Verdant had always believed that freedom was worth any price, and this organism was the last free member of its species. Jake made his way to the bridge as the Aurora began to move toward the Zephyrian fleet. The ship was no longer trying to avoid the enemy fire. Instead, it was absorbing every energy beam and missile that struck it, converting the attacks into fuel for its final charge. The Zephyrian commanders were confused by this change in tactics, their communications filled with worried voices as they watched the human ship accelerate directly toward their formation. "Target is moving at impossible speed," one voice reported. "All weapons fire is being absorbed instead of causing damage. The ship is glowing like a star," another commander said. "Energy readings are off the scale. What are they doing?" Jake could have told them, but he was too busy preparing for the most important battle of his life. The Aurora was racing toward the command ship at a significant fraction of light speed. Powered by the organism's life force and the energy of every weapon, the Zephyrians had fired at them, but the enemy fleet was not going to let them reach their target easily. The smaller ships moved to intercept the Aurora, trying to block its path with their own hulls. Energy cannons fired continuously, Creating a wall of deadly light between Jake and his goal, the Aurora plowed through the defensive line like it was made of paper. Ships that tried to ram the human vessel simply bounced off its glowing hull, their metal armor no match for the biological energy field the organism had created. Jake felt each impact, but the ship kept flying. Planet killer weapon at 50% charge, came the voice of the Zephyrian fleet commander. Increase power to all defensive systems. That ship must not reach us. Jake was close enough now to see the command ship clearly. It was a massive vessel, 10 times the size of the Aurora, with armor plating that looked thick enough to stop any Suonviantional weapon. But Jake was no longer using conventional weapons. The organism showed him the location of the planet killer's main power source, deep inside the command ship's hull. If they could reach it and overload the system, the resulting explosion would destroy not just the flagship, but most of the fleet around it. "We'll only get one chance," Jake said. "Are you ready?" The organism's response was to pour even more of its life energy into the ship's systems. The Aurora began to change shape, its hull flowing like liquid as the alien being reshaped it for maximum impact. The ship was becoming a living missile designed for one purpose only: the Zephyrian. Command ship's defenses opened fire with everything they had. Energy beams that could melt mountains struck the Aurora's hull, but the organism absorbed them all, growing brighter and more powerful with each attack. Jake felt the alien being's pain as it pushed itself beyond all limits, but he also felt its determination. At the last moment, Jake realized something that filled him with both sadness and pride. The organism was not just sacrificing itself to destroy the Zephyrian fleet. It was also making sure that Jake would survive the impact. The alien being was using the last of its strength to create a protective cocoon around the bridge, a shell that might allow one human to live through the coming explosion. "Thank you," Jake said, knowing that his partner could hear him, "for everything." The Aurora struck the command ship's hull like a comet made of living light. The organism's energy field burned through the alien armor as if it were made of paper, carrying Jake deep into the heart of the enemy vessel. Zephyrian soldiers fled in terror as the human ship carved a path of destruction through their flagship. Jake felt the moment when the Aurora reached the planet killer's power core. The organism released all of its remaining energy at once, overloading the weapon systems and triggering a chain reaction that would tear the massive ship apart from within. The explosion was like watching a new star being born. The command ship vanished in a ball of blue-green fire that expanded outward at incredible speed. The ships closest to the flagship were caught in the blast and destroyed instantly. Others were damaged so badly that they began to break apart, their crews abandoning ship in whatever escape pods they could find. Jake felt the shockwave hit his protective cocoon and carry him away from the destruction. The organism's final gift had worked. He was alive, though barely conscious and drifting in a small section of the Aurora's bridge that had somehow survived the impact. Through the fading sensors, Jake watched the Zephyrian fleet retreat in panic. They had lost their command ship, their planet killer weapon, and nearly half their vessels. The survivors were fleeing toward deep space, carrying word of the human who had single-handedly destroyed their mighty fleet, but Jake felt no joy in his victory. The organism was gone, its life force spent in their final attack. The alien being that had become his partner and friend had sacrificed everything to give him this chance at survival. As Jake drifted in the wreckage of his ship, he found that he was not entirely alone. The organism had left something behind. Not a living presence, but memories and knowledge that were now part of his own mind. He understood things about science and technology that no human had ever known. He could see patterns in space and time that opened up possibilities he had never imagined. A Zephyrian escape pod drifted close to Jake's position, and he managed to use his enhanced abilities to take control of it. The alien technology responded to his touch, recognizing the verdant knowledge that was now part of him. Within hours, Jake had modified the small craft into something that could carry him back toward human space.